Hey everyone, it's Sean. In this video, I'm going to be showing you guys some of what camera raw files are. I'm going to be showing you how to use the camera raw filter and further develop that color toning, color treating technique that we've been looking at thus far. So with that being said, let's just jump right in. In your camera raw demo folder, I've provided you guys with 3 different files we're going to be working through. I'm going to start at the bottom here with this image 1768 file, and what you can do is you can right click and hit open with Photoshop. Some of you might have Lightroom installed, so if you double click it might open in Lightroom, so I just want to make sure that we're all going to be working within Photoshop. When you open a camera raw file in Photoshop for the first time, there might be a window that pops up and asks you what format you'd like to see camera raw work in. I just chose the default format because it makes the most sense to me and I use it the most frequently. So what we have here is a photo of a couple airplanes at Billy Bishop Airport in front of the CN Tower, and it looks really gray and underexposed and not the greatest. So this filter, this window called Camera Raw, it has a lot of really powerful attributes to it that we can take a look at. The first one here being basic. These are some basic adjustments that we can sort of adjust to make our file look nicer. The first thing I'm going to do is just grab my exposure and drag it to the right to increase the exposure. Don't go too far because you can see you can really blow it out, but you want to go far enough that you start to get a lot of the details and stuff like that within your photo. The next thing we can do is we can adjust the contrast left or right. I'm going to add just a little bit of contrast, maybe 10, just to sort of deepen some of the shadows and whiten some of the whites. The next one here, highlights. This refers, it's not really talking about whites so much as it's talking about the hot areas of the photograph. So in this case, the majority of it is in the clouds. So you don't want to really like blow this out too far or leave it too low, because it'll either obviously overexpose or really flatten your highlights. And the same goes for shadows. So you can see the shadows are really sort of being affected down by the airplane here. And I'd like to see a little bit more of what's going on down there. So I'm just going to bring the shadows up to about 50. I'd say that should be fine. And now the whites and blacks. This is sort of what you might actually have considered to be shadows and highlights. Whites will sort of overexpose the whites the further to the right you bring them, and underexpose the further to the left. And the same thing goes with blacks. So how rich do you want your blacks to be? How washed out do you want them to be? In this case, I'd like to have fairly rich blacks, so I'm going to drag this down to about -50. And a cool thing about Camera Raw is you can go down here to this little icon in the bottom right of your sort of preview window, and if you click on it once, it will show you the original status of your photo versus the edits that you've just applied. So you can see that by using this one panel here within Camera Raw, we've really drastically changed how good this photo actually is. And we've really enhanced and brought out a lot of the visual information within it. The reason why we have so much play sort of room with this photograph is because it is a raw photo. There's zero decompression happening or zero compression happening with this photo. So it has the most amount of color information, the most amount of visual data within it to really be able to play around with. The next thing we can look at is Vibrance and Saturation. Most of you guys have probably heard of saturation. It's how saturated your colors are, and you can see that by dragging it to the right, we really bring out these colors, right? The vibrancy, though, I'm just going to bring this back down to 0. Vibrancy is a little bit different. Vibrancy doesn't just adjust saturation. It sort of adjusts like the overall luster, brightness, and depth of a color. So you can sort of see that we get a slightly different result when we adjust vibrancy. And the nice thing is that if you use them in tandem with each other, you tend to get these really beautiful, super bold colors as opposed to just using saturation. So I'm going to just leave these guys equally at 30 and 30. And I think I have a nice sort of set of colors working here. And we can sort of continue on. So from basic, we can go to curves. And I remember telling you guys earlier that we'd find a better visual representation of what curves do throughout these tutorials. And the visual representation is here. So right now we're on the curves adjustment as we're used to seeing it. But the cool thing is if you click on any of these other color channels, you'll be able to actually get a better visual representation of what the curves are going to adjust. So on the red channel, you'll be able to see that by dragging it up, you'll be affecting the highlights and creating more red tones within the photo. And by dragging it down into the shadows, you'll be adjusting the blue tints and adding more blue to your photo. And sort of like vice versa, coinciding with the rest of these guys. So I'm just going to go ahead and make some level adjustments. You guys are more than welcome to sort of edit this in whatever way you would like to. You know, it's really just a matter of personal taste and self-expression, really. So do what you guys think is best. But just by making these sort of subtle changes, you can see that we've really brought out a lot of the color in the sky, which is great. I'm just going to maybe add some yellows in the sort of highlight section, just because I kind of want this to feel maybe a little bit more summery as opposed to super gray and sad. The next thing that we can look down at is details. Details are really cool because this is where you're going to get sharpness and really a lot of crispness from our photo. You can sort of see that the CN Tower looks very flat, right? There's not a whole lot of details or depth happening, and there isn't really a whole lot happening down here either. So what we can do is on this masking slider here, if you guys hold down Alt Option and click and drag this out to the right, you'll get a mask, like a black and white representation of the slider. Everything that's white is what the sharpening slider up at the top is going to affect, and everything that's black is what it's going to ignore. This is pretty crucial because if you don't adjust this mask, you will be sharpening your entire image. And that's not necessarily what you want to have happen. You only want to sharpen and adjust the details of things that are actually considered details. So you can see that just by grabbing the sharpening slider and bringing it over, we did pull out more information from the CN Tower, which is pretty useful. If you guys go a little bit too far, or maybe your mask wasn't as specific, what you can do is you can use this noise reduction slider just a little bit, like usually about 15 is good enough, and it just helps to smooth over any of the noise that might have been created from that option. I'm just going to quickly jump back up to the basic slider here because I want to make a couple adjustments just to my exposure, highlights, things like that. Things are looking just a little bit too bright in those whites for my tasting right now, which is fine. And the next thing that we can take a quick look at, because it kind of coincides with the detail, is things like texture, clarity, and dehaze. Texture is kind of nice because it adds just a little bit more detail within the photo, right? It helps to bring out these finer details like the words porter. You could sort of see it added more windows sort of detail within the BMO building there. Clarity is like an overall sharpening of everything. It sort of helps to enhance reflections, get rid of any of milky haziness that's sort of lying around the photo. And then finally, dehaze. Really sort of, it adds a lot of contrast, and it too also works to get rid of any haziness that your camera or your camera sensor is sort of creating within the photo. So I'm going to just quickly check and see where we've come from. Boom, you know, fairly flat, really sad looking photo, to a very vibrant photo, lots of saturation, great details, and you know, we're well on our way to having a nicely edited photograph here. The next thing that we can take a look at is going to be the color mixer. The color mixer is sort of your hue, saturation, and luminance adjustment layer that you can make regularly within Photoshop, but it's all within one place, which is wonderful. So by adjusting the hues, this is going to be really easy to see on the reds. If I adjust the reds to be more magenta, you can see how the color of our plane is automatically starting to shift, right? But I can go down to the oranges and I can shift the oranges to be, oh, that's funny. It's not actually making a huge difference. You can see it on the tarmac our orange options down here, they're going from orange all the way to yellow. And then if we leave this back in the middle, that's what the actual color should have been. And you can sort of play around with these sliders and sort of get a better feeling for what they affect within the photograph. The blues are going to be a really good example of that. If we take the blues and we shift them all the way over to one side, our sky will become closer to the purples sort of section, you know? And if we drag it all the way to the left, they'll become closer to the aquas sort of section. So what I personally like to do is just bring in a little bit of aqua, shift the blues maybe just a little bit. They don't seem to be making a huge difference today. But there are some fun little details that you can sort of play around with in terms of coloring, and just sort of helps to beef everything up and really bring the colors more in line with what you'd like to see from them. Okay, cool. The next thing, saturation, you guessed it. You can sort of control the actual saturation of each color. So let's say you don't want your reds to be saturated, you can just drag them all the way down because the plane has some magenta within it as well. I think a little bit of orange. Actually, it has no orange, surprisingly. It must have a little bit of purple. There we go. You can see how you can really just affect the color of certain elements just by playing with these sliders. I'm going to bring them back to 0. There we go. Or you could beef them up, right? Maybe you want that plane to really pop and be like that cherry fire engine red color. That's totally cool. You can also adjust the aquas and the blues to help the sky really sort of contrast nicely. And finally is luminance. Luminance refers to the lightness of a color. So we can crank the luminance up on the red and it will sort of help to brighten it a little bit, bring it out of those shadows. We could do the same thing with the blues and you'll see that our blues become much lighter, or you can drag them down and they'll become much darker. Just a little word of the wise, obviously each picture is independent and requires its own consideration, but sometimes you do want to have a little bit of a lighter hand with all of this. So don't go super crazy, just go crazy enough to sort of enhance the photo or strike the tone that you're really looking for. Split toning underneath Color Mixer is really interesting because it allows you to affect just the highlights and the shadows of an image. So if you drag your color slider maybe into the yellows here and you up the saturation just a little bit, if you keep on going, you'll see that our highlights, so anything that was white, will now be slightly off white and into this yellow. You'll be able to see it a little bit better as I slide this slider across just for example. And you can see that all of the whites are going to take on a subtle change in hue and just a subtle saturation change depending on what colors you have selected. And the same things are true for the shadows. I'm not going to beef up the shadows too much, but you can see that just by making those two adjustments, we really warmed up the photograph fairly nicely. And the other thing to note here is you can change the balance. Do you want the highlights to have more influence and more priority? Shift it to the right. Do you want the shadows to have more influence and more priority? Shift it to the left. Finally, optics. Chromatic aberration is something that occurs in most photos. It's a very subtle sort of green and magenta tint that happens around the edges of things. You can check that on if you'd like. If it's really noticeable, check it on. If not, it's not the end of the world. Geometry, I don't ever really personally use geometry. It sort of has to deal with how you want to crop things, which I tend to crop things later on. Effects. Vignetting can be a nice addition if you use it subtly. I don't really ever go too crazy on this, but you can adjust things like the midpoint, the roundness of it, and the feather, which is how obvious it looks. And this just sort of helps to create a very subtle, like drawing your eye closer into the center sort of effect. And then finally, calibration. This has to do mainly with what camera you're using and stuff like that. So I'm not going to get too far into that because it's kind of unnecessary at this level. But yeah, we can sort of just check back one more time. This is our original, and this is our final sort of edited and toned version. So you can see that you really can up the quality of your photographs by bringing them into this Camera Raw filter. When you're finished this, though, the the way Photoshop sets this up is really silly. You could click on done or you can click on open. If you click on done, it will not actually open your photograph. It'll just replace or update the camera raw file in your Finder, but it won't actually load it into Photoshop for you to continue editing. For you to load it into Photoshop to continue editing, you have to hit the open button. I can't tell you how many times I've hit done and expected Photoshop to open, and it just sort of did nothing, and it was very disappointing. So your computer might be a little bit slower like mine, and it needs some time to read the camera raw format. That's totally fine. That's because this is a massive file that it's trying to open and sort of deal with. So let's just hang tight and wait for that to finish doing its thing. Okay, cool. So here we have our camera raw file opened. If we just right click on the rulers, or if you guys don't have your rulers turned on, you can hit Command R to turn them on. And if we right click and shift this over to pixels, you can just see how large this file actually is. We can click on Window and turn on the info panel, and by selecting everything using Command A, you can see this is 3450 by 5184. So that's quite a large photograph. And now you have all sorts of information to be able to go in, play around, select things, mask it out, what have you, and create just a really nice composition there. I'm going to walk through one more with you guys, and I'm going to use this middle one, 02105. I'm just going to open it up. That's funny, it doesn't want to open in Photoshop right away. So I'm going to click and drag it and open it up in Photoshop by dragging it over the icon. And it should open the camera raw filter, which it did. Lovely. And this time I'm just going to go through this maybe a little bit quicker. So this is obviously a picture of iced coffee. You have some really great movement happening down in here, and you have some really great colors and stuff like that. So the goal for this one maybe is going to create a little bit more of a moodier photo, something that doesn't have as strong color saturation and things like that. So we're going to sort of play around and see what we can get. You can see that by upping the texture, you can start to see some of these sweat beads on the mason jar, which is really cool. We can even increase the clarity, and you'll start to see more detail within the milk that's streaming through it. And I'm just going to beef up the dehaze so that I can get those inkier blacks and really sort of give this photo a little bit more appeal, just like moody wise. We can adjust the temperature. It feels a little bit cool right now, so by dragging this into the yellows, you'll see how it just sort of starts to warm the photo up. And same with the tint, just a little bit to bring in those magentas, and we're starting to make this feel like it's a bit warmer of a summer day where we're actually warranted in having iced coffee instead of, the middle of fall. I'm going to take the curves, and I'm going to shift the blacks a little bit in. I'm going to shift the highlights a little bit down. I'm going to just increase the lightness of some of the shadows, decrease some of the highlights there. And then going into the separate channels, I'm going to bring in some more yellows into the shadows. And I'm going to bring some slightly redder tints into the highlights there, and just making sure that I balance everything out sort of with another anchor point in the center. Cool. Details, holding Alt-Option on the masking and making sure that I'm really just getting the finer details within everything there, and just sharpening it even more so that those beads of sweat are even more visible. And maybe just adding a bit of noise reduction, just in case. Now for the color mixer, I'm going to jump back into the hue panel. And now's the time where we're really going to be able to sort of affect the color of this creamy coffee. I sort of want it to look a little bit more on the amber side, just because I think that coffee looks beautiful when you can see those little hints of ambery goodness. So I'm relatively happy with that. That looks good. I'm going to jump into the saturation though. I'm not a huge fan of these cool teal sort of steel colors that are happening in the background. So I'm just going to desaturate any of my blues that are happening. I really just want this photo to be focused on the nice warmer colors of yellow, orange, and amber. And what I can do too is I can go to Luminance and I can increase the luminance of our red and really sort of get some more details happening within our coffee, which is lovely. Split toning. This is where I can actually add some stuff into the shadows and just make it look even more warmer than it actually is. I'm not going to affect the highlights because I actually like the color of this sort of creamy white, and I don't want to change that. Again, it all just comes down to, personal preferences, style choices, and what you guys like. You don't have to style this the exact same way that I am. And I'm going to actually add a fairly heavy vignette this time. And I'm going to increase or change the roundness so that it's more of a vertical roundness instead of a horizontal roundness, and really push the feathering so that we just wind up with a vignette that's around the edge of our photograph, but isn't really that obvious. And now that I've made all of my adjustments and I'm pretty happy with them, I'm going to just click on my before and after and just see what this photo looked like before. Relatively flat, very blue and cold whites, almost no warmth to this, not super appetizing looking. And then if we click on it and it changes, when it changes, that looks like an iced coffee that I would be very happy to sip on in the summer. I get that it's super dramatic, but I kind of wanted to go for a pretty dramatic aesthetic in this case. And we can hit done. It'll open up in Photoshop and life will be great. And there we have it, opened in Photoshop, ready to edit even further, or format for maybe printing purposes or whatever your project needs are. Now, the last thing I'd like to show you guys, I added a file from Unsplash for you guys. It's just a top lay of some granola, and I'm just going to open it in Photoshop by clicking and dragging it down onto the Photoshop icon. And I just wanted to point out that you guys can use Camera Raw even if you aren't actually editing a raw file. So this is a standard JPEG brought in from the internet. It's probably in an sRGB color space. And what I want to do is I want to right click on background and hit convert to smart object. I'll get more into smart objects as we go through more compositing and stuff. But for now, just right click and hit convert to smart object. And if we go up to filter here, you can see that there's a Camera Raw filter option. And when we click on that, it opens up a window that is very similar to the one that we were just editing in. Here we go. It has all of the same options, all of the same effects. It's just as powerful as it would have been if this was a real Camera Raw image. And, this is just a good place for you guys to play around with another type of image. So let's just say I've made all the adjustments that I want to make. I can hit OK. And now this is the beauty of a smart object is after you apply a filter or an adjustment, it will remember the filter and adjustment that you made, and you can double click and go back in and continue adjusting those changes. This goes back to the concept of non-destructive editing that we talked about, and it will just help you to be a more organized designer or Photoshopper, and it'll allow you to be able to fluidly make changes as they come up instead of having to go back and start all the way fresh from step one if you really sort of got too far off the track with your Photoshop work and with your editing. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is Camera Raw. I hope you find it useful. I hope you can find a way to work it into some of your projects. I'll catch you guys in the next video. See ya.